she was alone, stranded, and her baby was coming whether she was ready or not. When the storm swallowed her ship whole, Wubit never imagined she'd wash ashore on a forgotten island, bleeding, breathless, and staring up at a man with cold eyes and a jaw cut from stone. He said his name was simply Fasil. He said he was nobody, but nobody carries themselves like a man who owns half the world, and nobody looks at a ruined woman like she is still worth saving unless they have something to hide. Who is this stranger? Why is he here? And why does he keep watching her like she's a secret he's already decided to keep? If you love slow burn romance, hidden identities, and stories that grab your heart and refuse to let go, you are in the right place. Don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell, because this story is only getting started. The morning Wubit boarded the ship, the sea was the colour of a bruise. She had noticed it that deep, ugly purple pressing against the horizon, but she had told herself it was nothing. She had been telling herself a lot of things were nothing lately, that the ache in her lower back was just fatigue, that the tightening across her belly every few hours was just the baby shifting, that leaving everything behind on the eve of her confinement was a choice made out of strength and not desperation. She was very good at lying to herself. She stood at the railing of the merchant vessel, one hand pressed flat against her stomach, watching the Ethiopian coastline disappear behind her like a secret being swallowed. She was 6 months gone with child, though her body carried it as if she were further. Her ankles had swollen inside her leather boots. Her back ached from the weight of the life growing inside her. And still she had come aboard this ship with nothing but a worn travel bag, a letter she had not yet decided whether to burn, and a name that belonged to a man who did not know she existed. Her name was Wubit. It meant beautiful in her mother tongue, and her mother had given it to her with full intention, running a proud thumb across her newborn cheek and saying, "This child will never be invisible." Her mother had been wrong about many things, but she had been most wrong about that. Wubit was 23 years old. She was the daughter of a cloth merchant in Gondar, a man of modest means who had loved her loudly until the fever took him 2 winters ago. She had no siblings, no husband, not anymore. The man she had married at 17 had proven to be the kind of man who could love a woman gently and leave her cruelly, and he had done exactly that. When he discovered she was carrying a child, he claimed he was not certain was his. He had said the words quietly, almost kindly, which had somehow made it worse. She had not wept. She had sat very still in the middle of their bedroom while he spoke, and when he was done, she had risen, folded the letter she had received that week from her mother's oldest friend in London, a woman named Aziza, a respectable widow with a warm house and no children, and she had begun to pack. Aziza had written to say that she had room, that Wubit could come, that no child should enter the world without a safe place to land. Wubit had read those words 3 times, pressing her fingers against the ink as if she could feel the kindness in them, and she had made up her mind within the hour. She was going to London. She was going to have this baby in warmth and in safety, and she was never, not once, going to look back. That was what she had decided on the morning she boarded the ship, when the sea was the colour of a bruise and something in her chest whispered that she should wait. She had ignored that whisper. She was good at that too. The storm came on the 3rd day. It did not announce itself the way storms in stories do. There was no gradual darkening, no slow build of wind. One moment the sea was grey and restless, and the next the sky cracked open like something furious had been waiting inside it. The crew began shouting in languages she only half understood. The vessel lurched. Water came over the railing in sheets so heavy they knocked her off her feet, and Wubit hit the deck hard on her side, one arm wrapped around her stomach out of pure instinct, her mouth full of salt and fear. She remembered hands. She remembered someone dragging her upright, a sailor with kind eyes telling her to go below. She remembered trying to stand, and finding her legs had forgotten how. She remembered the sound god, the sound of it wood splitting somewhere deep in the belly of the ship, a groan that she felt more than heard, a sound that meant this vessel was already dying and they were all still inside it. She did not remember going into the water. She remembered the cold of it, the absolute breathtaking cold that pressed in from every direction at once, and the strange, distant panic of not knowing which way was up. She remembered kicking. She remembered her bag tearing away from her shoulder. She remembered the letter, the one from Aziza, the one she had not yet burned, disappearing into the black. And then she remembered nothing. When she opened her eyes, there was sand beneath her cheek. Fine, pale sand, warm in a way that made no sense given how cold she still felt inside. She was on her back. The sky above her was a washed-out blue, innocent and empty, as if it had not just tried to kill her. She lay there for a long moment, just breathing, taking inventory of what still worked. Her fingers, her feet, the slow, insistent pressure in her belly that told her the baby was still there, still moving, still stubbornly alive. She tried to sit up, and the world tilted sideways. Don't. The voice came from above her. Low, controlled. The kind of voice that did not ask it instructed. She turned her head and found him. He was crouched a few feet away, watching her with eyes that were dark and completely unreadable. He was tall, she could tell. Even with him crouched, there was a length to his limbs that suggested height. His clothes were ruined, soaked through and torn at the shoulder, but they had clearly once been fine, very fine, the kind of fine that did not come from merchant money or military commission. He had a cut across his jaw that had dried to a dark line, and his hair was close cropped, and he was looking at her the way you look at something you are not sure whether to approach. "You swallowed half the sea," he said. "Sit up too fast and you'll bring it back up." She stared at him. "Who are you?" Something moved across his face. Not quite discomfort, something more contained than that. "Fasil," he said. Just the one word. "Fasil," she repeated. She waited for the rest. A family name, a title, something. He gave her nothing. She looked past him at the tree line beyond the beach, at the unfamiliar shapes of the vegetation, at the absolute, pressing silence of a place with no roads and no smoke and no sign of any other living soul. Her heart did something slow and horrible in her chest. "Where are we?" she asked, though she already knew the answer would not be a good one. "I don't know," he said. She looked back at him. He was still watching her with that same careful, measured expression, and she had the sudden, unsettling feeling that he was a man who almost never admitted to not knowing things. That those 3 words had cost him something small but real. "Were you on the ship?" she asked. "Yes." "Is anyone else?" "Not that I've found." She let that settle. She pressed her palm flat against her stomach and felt the baby move a slow roll, like a question being turned over, and she thought about Aziza's house in London, warm and waiting, already impossibly far away. She thought about the letter she had lost in the water, the address she had memorized but now felt uncertain of, the name of the street she was no longer sure she remembered correctly. She thought about her mother, who had named her beautiful and meant it as a prophecy. She was stranded on an island she couldn't name, with no supplies and no rescue and no certainty of anything. Her baby was coming in 3 months, maybe less. And the only other person on this shore was a man with fine ruined clothes and careful eyes who had told her his name like he was only lending it to her. "Can you stand?" Fasil asked. His voice was the same, steady, unhurried, but something in it had shifted by a degree she couldn't quite name. "Yes," she said, before she had tested whether it was true. She pushed herself upright. The world swayed. She locked her knees and breathed through her nose and refused to fall, and after a moment the horizon settled back into place. She was standing. Barely, but standing. He was watching her with something that was almost, not quite, but almost like respect. "Good," he said. He straightened to his full height, and she had been right. He was tall, tall enough that she had to lift her chin to look at him properly, and there was something in the way he stood easy, certain, like a man who had never once walked into a room and wondered if he belonged there, that made a quiet alarm sound somewhere in the back of her mind. Nobody stood like that without a reason. He turned toward the tree line. "We need shelter before dark." Wubit looked at his back, at the clean line of his shoulders beneath those ruined, expensive clothes, and the alarm grew a little louder. She followed him anyway. She didn't have a choice, but she kept her eyes open. The forest breathed. That was the only way Wubit could describe it, the way the trees seemed to exhale around them as they pushed through the undergrowth, the thick, warm air pressing against her skin like something alive and watchful. Every sound was unfamiliar. Birds she couldn't name called from somewhere above. Branches snapped under Fassel's boots with a sharp authority, and she followed the sound of him more than she followed the sight, because the light beneath the canopy was already growing thin and golden in the way that meant evening was coming faster than she was ready for. Her body was protesting everything. The wet clothes clung to her and chafed. Her boots had filled with water and never truly emptied, and each step made a miserable sound that she tried to ignore. The tightening she had been dismissing for days moved across her belly again, slower this time, more deliberate, and she pressed a hand to the side of her stomach and breathed through it the way her mother's midwife had once told her to, low and steady, and it passed. She did not tell Faisal. She didn't know why, exactly. Perhaps because telling him felt like handing him something she wasn't ready to give. Perhaps because the way he moved through this forest eyes scanning, jaw set, completely unbothered by the strangeness of their situation, made her want to appear equally unbothered. It was foolish. She knew it was foolish. But she held the pain quietly and kept walking. He stopped without warning, and she nearly walked into his back. "There?" he said. She looked past him. A rock face rose about 30 meters ahead, half swallowed by roots and climbing plants, and at its base there was a natural hollow, not quite a cave, but close enough, deep enough to offer cover. The rock overhead would keep rain out. The overhang was wide. "You found this on your own?" she asked. "I've been on the island since this morning," he said it without turning around. "I walked the shoreline." She looked at the back of his head. "You were awake before me." "Yes." "How long before me?" A pause, brief, but she caught it. A few hours. She thought about that, him moving through this place alone, mapping it, cataloguing it, while she lay unconscious on the beach. The cut on his jaw, the tear at his shoulder. He had survived the same storm she had, hit the same water, washed up on the same shore, and he had risen and immediately begun to work. Either he was extraordinary, or he had been trained for exactly this kind of thing. Neither option made her feel entirely comfortable. They reached the hollow, and she was grateful enough for it that she set her unease aside. The ground inside was dry. Dead leaves had collected in the corners, and Fassel crouched and began to clear them out with his hands, methodical and efficient. And Wubit stood at the entrance and looked out at the forest darkening around them, and tried to think practically. "We need water," she said. "Fresh water. There's a stream, 20 minutes east." He kept working. "I'll go at first light. And food. Tomorrow." She turned to look at him. "You're very calm about this." He glanced up at her then, and for just a moment, one brief, unguarded second, something passed across his face that she couldn't quite read. It wasn't calm. It was something that had been placed over something else, carefully. The way you lay a cloth over a wound you don't want anyone to see. "One of us needs to be," he said, and looked back down. She didn't have an answer for that. She moved inside the hollow and lowered herself carefully to the ground, back against the rock wall, one hand resting on her belly. The baby shifted. She exhaled. "Your child," Faisal said. He hadn't looked up again. "How far along?" 6 months. Perhaps closer to 7. Another pause. "Longer this time. You boarded a ship at 6 months. It was not a question. It was not quite a judgment either. It landed somewhere in between, and she felt the edge of it. "I didn't have another option," she said, and her voice came out steadier than she expected. He said nothing, which was somehow worse than if he had pushed. She watched him work and thought about the options she'd had and the ones she hadn't, and the husband who had looked at her with such quiet certainty when he said the child might not be his. She thought about her father's grave in Gondar and the empty house she had locked behind her. She thought about Aziza's letter dissolving in the black water of the storm, and wondered if she had memorized the address correctly, wondered if it mattered now. Stop, she told herself. One thing at a time. He had cleared a space large enough for both of them and gathered a pile of dry leaves into something roughly bed-shaped. It was practical and unglamorous, and she was more grateful for it than she could say. "Sleep," he told her. "You're not sleeping? I'll take first watch." She looked at him. "You think something's out there. I think this island is unfamiliar, and I'd rather not discover its dangers while unconscious." He settled back against the rock near the entrance, arms resting on his knees. "Sleep, Wubit." He said her name. Just like that, as if he had been practicing it, as if it fit easily in his mouth. She didn't know why it unsettled her. She lay down on the leaves and closed her eyes and told herself she would not sleep because it wasn't safe and she didn't trust him and she needed to stay alert. She was asleep within minutes. She woke to voices. Her eyes opened before her body moved a stillness. She had learned as a child in her father's house, where you listened before you revealed yourself. The hollow was dark, but not fully black. Pale, early light was beginning to filter in from outside. Fazil was not where she had left him. She sat up slowly. The voices were coming from the tree line, 2 of them. One was Fazil's low, controlled. The other was higher, younger, and speaking in broken, rapid English with an accent she couldn't place. She rose carefully, one hand braced against the rock, and moved to the entrance of the hollow. Fazil stood at the edge of the trees. Across from him, half hidden in the undergrowth, was a boy. A young man, really perhaps 16 or 17, thin as a reed, with wide, frightened eyes and a cut on his forehead that had crusted over badly. He was wearing what had once been a ship's boy uniform, now destroyed by water and forest. He was alive. Somehow, impossibly, alive. He was staring at Fazil the way you stare at something you can't decide whether to run from. She stepped out of the hollow. "You were on the ship." Both of them turned. The boy's eyes landed on her stomach and went even wider. Fazil's eyes landed on her face and did the thing they always did, that quick, measuring assessment, like he was calculating something. The boy swallowed. "Yes, ma'am. I worked the rigging. My name is Temesgen." His English was uncertain but earnest. "I thought I was the only one." "You're not," she said. She looked at the cut on his forehead. It needed cleaning. It needed more than cleaning. The edges were beginning to show the angry red that meant infection was considering moving in. She felt something shift in her, a practicality that had always lived quietly in her bones, the same practicality that had sat her upright in the middle of her ruined marriage and made her pack a bag. "Come here," she said to Temesgen, and her voice surprised her, steady and certain. "Let me look at that." The boy glanced at Fazil. Fazil said nothing, but something in his posture shifted by the smallest degree, a kind of permission, or perhaps surprise, and Temesgen moved toward her. She examined the cut with careful hands while the morning light grew. It was bad, but manageable. She needed clean water and something to bind it with, and she had neither at the moment, but she kept her face composed because the boy was watching her with the naked desperation of someone very young who needed very badly to believe that an adult had a plan. "It's going to be fine," she told him. "We'll clean it properly when we reach the stream." Temesgen let out a breath that seemed to come from somewhere deep and held back. "Yes, ma'am." She became aware that Fazil was watching her. She straightened and met his eyes, and found in them something she hadn't expected, Not the usual careful blankness, but something warmer and quickly contained, like a fire that had been startled into lighting and then immediately banked. "The stream," she said to him. "You said it was east." "Yes." "Then we should go." He held her gaze for a moment. "You lead people," he said. It wasn't a compliment exactly. It was an observation made with something that might have been wonder. "My father was a merchant," she said simply. "You learn to take charge or you get taken advantage of." She turned and began walking east. It was halfway to the stream that Temesgen fell. He stumbled on a root and went down hard and fast, and when Wubit turned back, she saw immediately that this was not just a stumble. His face was the wrong colour, his hands were shaking, and when she touched his forehead, she found a heat that had no business being that high. The infection had not been considering moving in. It had already arrived. She crouched beside him, and the world around her became very still and very focused, the way it did when there was a real problem and everything unnecessary fell away. Vassal was beside her in seconds, and she felt him crouch on the boy's other side. She did not look up. She was counting the boy's breaths. She was thinking about plants, which ones she knew, which ones her mother's cook had used for fever. Whether any of them grew in a forest she didn't know, on an island she couldn't name. "How bad?" Vassal asked. "Bad enough," she said. "I need to get him to the water. I need to clean this wound properly, and I need to find the right leaves. There's a plant my mother used it. Broad leaves, slightly silver on the underside. It draws out heat. I don't know if it grows here." "Describe it again." She looked up then. He was already looking at the trees around them, scanning with those careful eyes, and something about the intensity of it made her chest tighten in a way that had nothing to do with fear. "I'll know it if I see it," she said. "Then you look while I carry him." He lifted Temesgen without making it look like effort, and Wubit rose and began to move through the forest, with her eyes tracking every leaf, every low branch, every shadow of green, looking for a plant from her mother's kitchen in a forest that belonged to neither of them. She found it 20 steps from the stream. The leaves were exactly as she remembered, broad and slightly silver when the light caught the underside, and she stripped several carefully and said a quiet word of gratitude to no one and everyone at once. By the time she reached the water, Fassel had Temesgen laid out on the bank, and she knelt and went to work without hesitation, cleaning the wound with cold water and her own careful hands, pressing the bruised leaves against the skin the way she'd watched done 100 times, binding it with a strip torn from the hem of her already ruined dress. She worked in silence. Fassel crouched beside her, handing her what she asked for, without her needing to explain herself, and that ease, that wordless understanding, was somehow the most unsettling thing he had done yet. When it was done, she sat back on her heels and pressed her fist against her mouth and breathed. "You've done that before," Fassel said quietly. "My father got sick," she said. "Often. We couldn't always afford a physician." He was quiet for a moment. "And you learned." "I had to." She looked at Temesgen, whose colour was a fraction better, whose breathing had slowed into something steadier. Then she looked at the stream, at the clear, cold water moving over the stones, and she thought about how 3 days ago she had been standing at the railing of a ship, watching her country disappear. She thought about how far she was from everything she had known, how entirely alone she had expected to be. She was not alone. She was not safe either, she understood that, felt it in the watchfulness of the trees and the ache of her back and the uncertainty of the life growing inside her. But she was not alone. She looked at Fassel. He was looking at the water, profile to her, and in the morning light she saw the thing she had been almost seeing since the moment she woke on the beach. The way he held himself, the way he spoke, the way he had lifted that boy without making a production of it, the way he assessed a situation and moved through it without wasted motion. It was not the bearing of a nobody. It was the bearing of a man who had spent a lifetime being significant. She looked away before he could catch her staring. "We need to build a fire," she said. "The boy needs warmth." "Yes," Fassel agreed. She rose and began to gather wood, and she felt his eyes on her back, and the forest breathed around them, and somewhere above the canopy the sun continued its patient climb, indifferent to all of it. The fire took longer than it should have. Faisal struck the stones together with a patience that Wubit found herself watching without meaning, to the set of his shoulders, the quiet concentration on his face, the way he did not curse or rush or show any sign of frustration, even when the sparks died 3 times in a row. She had gathered wood without being asked. She had arranged it without being told. And when the flame finally caught and Temesgen was moved close enough to feel the warmth, she sat across the fire from Faisal and watched the boy's chest rise and fall, and told herself the tightening across her belly was nothing. It was not nothing. It had been coming since dawn, a slow, rolling pressure that started low and moved upward, and then released, and then returned, regular, patient, deliberate in a way that her body had never been deliberate before. She knew what it was. She had known what it was since the stream, maybe before that, maybe since she had crouched over Temesgen with careful hands and felt the first one move through her like a wave deciding whether to break. She was not 6 months along. She understood that now with a cold and total clarity. She had been counting wrong or refusing to count right, because the truth of it had been too large to hold. The baby was not coming in 3 months. The baby was not even coming in 1 month. The baby was coming now, or close enough to now that the difference was academic and terrifying and completely outside her control. She pressed her palm flat to her stomach and breathed through it and looked into the fire and made herself think. She could not tell Faisal. That thought came first, and it was instinct, pure and irrational, and she recognized it as irrational but could not yet dislodge it. Everything about this man made her want to appear capable and unbroken. Everything about him, the steadiness, the competence, the way he had lifted Temesgen like it cost him nothing, made her want to match it. She was aware that this was pride working against her survival. She was aware, and she still sat quietly and breathed through the tightening and said nothing. Temesgen slept. The forest around them had gone into that deep afternoon quiet, where even the birds seemed to be holding their breath, and the only sounds were the fire and the boy's even breathing, and the distant, indifferent conversation of the stream. Faisal was looking at the tree line. He did it often, that scanning look, systematic and trained, and each time she watched him do it, she felt the gap between what he claimed to be and what he clearly was grow a little wider. "You should eat something," he said, without turning his head. "I'm fine." "You haven't eaten since before the storm." She had not thought he was paying attention. "Neither have you." "I'm not carrying a child." She looked at him then. He was still facing the trees. His jaw was set, and the dried cut on it had gone from dark red to brown, and there was something in the line of his profile, clean and precise and somehow familiar, the way faces are sometimes familiar when they belong to people whose portraits hang in places you have only heard about. That made the back of her mind ring again with that quiet, persistent alarm. "I found fruit," he said, and produced from the fold of his ruined coat 3 small yellow-green things that she didn't recognize, but that smelled sharply sweet. He held them out without looking at her. She took them. She ate 2 of them before she registered the taste, because her body had decided hunger was more urgent than dignity, and the 3rd she pressed into Temesgen's slack hand for when he woke. Another wave moved through her. This one was longer. She set her teeth and breathed through her nose and kept her face completely still, and it passed. And when she looked up, Faisal was watching her. Not the trees. Her. She met his eyes, said nothing. His eyes dropped very briefly, very deliberately to the hand she had pressed against her stomach without realizing she'd done it. Then they came back to her face. Wubit. His voice was different. The control was still there, but something underneath it had shifted the way the ground shifts before a tremor. "Tell me what is happening." She opened her mouth to say nothing is happening, and the next contraction arrived the strongest yet, long and gripping, and absolutely indifferent to her composure. and what came out instead of words was a sharp exhale through her teeth that said everything she had been refusing to say. He was on his feet before it passed. He crossed to her side of the fire in 3 steps and crouched in front of her, and his face was close and very serious, and all the careful blankness was gone from it. Underneath was something raw and urgent that she hadn't expected and didn't know what to do with. "How long?" he said. It was not a question. "Since dawn," she said, and her voice came out smaller than she intended. Something moved through his face. She could not name it. He looked at her for a long moment, and she looked back at him, and the fire crackled between them and the forest breathed, and she felt the full weight of their situation settle over her, like something physical. No physician, no midwife, no shelter beyond a rock hollow, no supplies, no certainty of rescue, and for the first time since the storm, she felt the edges of her composure begin to genuinely buckle. "I don't know how to do this," she said. She had not planned to say it. It came out raw and honest, and once it was out, she couldn't take it back. "I don't know how to have a baby on an island with I don't know how to do this." He held her gaze. He did not look away, and he did not offer her empty comfort, and he did not tell her it would be fine. He said, very steadily, "I know enough." She stared at him. "What does that mean?" "It means I have seen this done. I know what is needed and what to watch for." He said it the way he said everything, with that quiet certainty, and she felt something in her chest that was equal parts relief and fury, because who was he? Who was this man who claimed to be nobody, and knew too many things, and looked at her like she was a problem he had already decided to solve? "Who are you?" she said. Not the polite version she had asked on the beach. The real one. The one that had been building since the moment she had seen him stand. He looked at her for a long moment. The fire between them made shadows move across his face. "Right now," he said carefully, "I am the only person on this island who can help you. That is enough." It was a deflection. She recognized it as a deflection, and she hated that he was right. The next hours were the longest of her life. He moved with a purpose that she could not have manufactured from nothing, sending Temesgen, who had woken feverish but functional, to gather specific things from the forest with descriptions precise enough that the boy found most of them. Water boiled over the fire in a wide, curled piece of bark that Fazl had fashioned into a vessel with a patience that had nothing frantic in it. He tore strips from his own coat, the fine, expensive coat that was already ruined, and set them to clean in the boiling water and dried them over the fire's edge, with the focus of a man who had been told exactly what to do for exactly this situation and had committed it entirely to memory. She watched him, and she laboured, and she refused to make more noise than she could help, and the contractions came faster, and the light changed from gold to orange to the deep purple of evening, and she thought about her mother, and about her father's grave, and about the letter she had lost in the water, and she thought about the man she had married, who had looked at her with such quiet certainty when he said he wasn't sure the child was his, and she felt something in her chest that had been living there since that day, cold and dense and heavy, the weight of being doubted by someone who was supposed to know her, begin, very slowly, to come loose. She was doing this. She was here, on this impossible island, in this impossible situation, and she was doing it, breath by breath. And nobody had carried her here, and nobody had made this choice for her, and the child inside her was hers, fully and completely and without question. Hers, and she was going to bring it into the world if it took everything she had. "Look at me," Fassel said. She looked at him. He was close, closer than he had been, crouched at her level, and his eyes were steady and direct, and she had the sudden, dizzying sense that he was giving her something, not instruction, not direction, but something more personal than that, an anchor. "Breathe," he said, "just breathe." "I am breathing," she said, and it came out almost like a laugh, thin and desperate at the edges. "Breathe better," he said, and there was something in it, the smallest crack in the control, the ghost of something warm, and she did laugh then, briefly and painfully. And then the next contraction hit, and everything narrowed down to the single animal fact of her body and what it was doing. Temesgen had gone quiet at the fire. He had his knees pulled to his chest and his hands folded, and his lips moving in something that might have been prayer, and she was glad for him, glad for the small human presence of him, glad she was not doing this with only the forest watching. It was fully dark when the baby came. She heard it before she understood it, a sound so new and so absolute that her mind went completely blank for a moment, wiped clean of everything except the sheer, staggering fact of it, a cry, small and furious, and insisting on itself, with a force entirely disproportionate to its size. Fazil placed the baby against her chest. She looked down. A girl, impossibly small, dark-eyed and wrinkled, and already turning her face toward warmth with the blind, urgent certainty of something that has always known exactly what it needs. Wubit's hands were shaking. She hadn't realized her hands were shaking until she tried to hold the baby and found them trembling in a way she couldn't stop. She pressed her daughter against her chest and bent her head and breathed in the smell of her, something clean and particular and entirely new, and she felt the thing in her chest that had been dense and cold and heavy come loose completely and dissolve into something warm and enormous that she had no name for and did not need one. She was crying. She hadn't cried in months. Not at her husband's quiet betrayal, not at her father's empty house, not in the water when the ship was dying around her. She was crying now, silently, into the crown of her daughter's head, and she did not try to stop. She became aware of Vasil. He was very still. He was sitting back from her, with his hands resting on his knees, and his head slightly bowed. And there was something about the set of him, the way the stillness was not his usual controlled stillness, but something quieter, something undone that made her look at him properly. He was looking at the baby, and the expression on his face was one she had not seen on him before. Not the careful blankness, not the measuring assessment, something open and undefended and entirely unaware of itself. The face of a man who has been caught off guard by something beautiful. He felt her looking. He raised his eyes to hers. For a long moment neither of them spoke. The fire crackled. Temesgen, across the camp, had his face buried in his hands with what appeared to be profound relief. The island breathed around them, dark and enormous and indifferent. "She's alive," Wubit said. Her voice was wrecked. "She's alive, and she's perfect." Something moved through Fasil's face. He pressed his lips together. He nodded once, and it was a small motion, but it cost him something. She could see that it cost him something, and she understood without being told that this man had not expected to care. He had not planned to be moved, and he was. She looked back down at her daughter and felt the full weight of a decision settling into her bones. Not a dramatic decision, not a loud one, but the quiet, absolute kind. The kind you make not with your mind, but with something deeper. She had come aboard a ship to reach a safe place to raise her child. She had lost the ship. She had lost the address. She had lost almost everything. But she was here. Her daughter was here. And the man across the fire, who claimed to be nobody, was watching her child like she was the first real thing he had seen in a very long time. She did not know who he was. She knew she was going to find out. She named the baby Leah. It came to her in the grey hour before dawn, when the island was neither fully dark nor fully light, and the baby was sleeping against her chest with the boneless, absolute trust of something that has never known betrayal. Liar. It meant close to the heart in the old tongue, and Wubit said it once, quietly, into the soft crown of her daughter's head, and felt it settle like a thing that had always been true and had only just been spoken aloud. Fasil was awake. He was always awake before her. She had learned that in the days since the birth, 3 days now, each one slower and more surreal than the last, and she had stopped pretending it unsettled her. She had stopped pretending a great many things. Pain did that to a person. Birth did that. The particular vulnerability of lying on an island floor with a new life in your hands and no choice but to trust the stranger across the fire that did it most of all. He was at the stream when she woke properly. She heard him before she saw him. The particular rhythm of his movement through the trees that she had learned to distinguish from the sounds of the forest. He came back with water and with something she didn't recognize, a flat greenish fruit that he had been finding for 2 days, the one that gave her something close to enough, and he set it beside her without fanfare and crouched to check the fire. "How is she?" he asked. She slept. Wubit looked down at Leah. The baby's face was composed and serious in the way of newborns, already working out the terms of the world. She woke once in the night, and then slept again. Faisal nodded. He did not reach for the baby. He never did, and she noticed it every time the way he would look at Leah with that undefended expression, the one that appeared without his permission and disappeared the moment he caught himself, and then look away, as if looking was already more than he had intended to allow himself. Temesgen was recovering. The fever had broken on the second night, leaving him wrung out and grateful in the way of someone who has genuinely considered the alternative. He was sitting up now, eating the last of the fruit Faisal had brought, watching the two of them with the open, uncomplicated attention of a teenager who has not yet learned to disguise his interest. "Do you think anyone is looking for us?" he asked. Faisal was quiet for a moment. "Yes," he said. The certainty of it made Wubit look up. He was staring into the fire, and his jaw was set, and there was something in that one word, not hope, exactly, but something more weighted than hope. Something that sounded like knowledge. She filed it away. She had been filing things away for days. The search party came on the morning of the 4th day. She heard the ship before she saw it, a distant, irregular sound that her mind initially refused to translate correctly because she had stopped expecting it. Then Temesgen scrambled to his feet and pointed through the tree line toward the glint of light on water, and she heard him make a sound that was not quite words, and she understood. Faisal was already moving. He moved through the trees with a speed she hadn't seen from him before, that controlled economy gone and replaced with something urgent and direct, and she gathered Leah against her chest and followed with Temesgen at her side, and they came out onto the beach just as a longboat was cutting toward shore from the vessel, anchored in the shallow water beyond the reef. There were 4 men in the boat. They were in livery, dark blue, with gold at the collar, and even from the distance she could see the way they carried themselves, the precision of uniformed men in the service of someone significant. Her eyes went immediately to Faisal. He had stopped at the water's edge. His back was to her. His shoulders were very straight and very still, and he stood the way she had known from the first morning that he stood, as if the ground beneath him belonged to him. As if the concept of space that was not his had never occurred to him, and she felt the thing she had been carrying for 4 days crystallize suddenly into something sharp and clear. She knew. She had known for a while. She had simply been waiting for the moment when she would no longer be able to pretend otherwise. The longboat reached the shore, and the first man out was on his knees in the sand before he had fully straightened, and what he said was, not, "Are you all right?" or "We've been searching." What he said was, in accented English, with his head bowed and his voice tight with what was clearly relief, held rigidly in check, "Your Grace, thank God." The beach went very quiet. Wubit stood on the sand with her daughter against her chest and watched Fazl's back, and felt something move through her that was not quite anger and not quite betrayal, and was perhaps closest to the feeling of having stood on ground you believed was solid, and discovering the solid part was always smaller than you thought. He turned around. He looked at her first. Not at the men, not at the boat, at her. And his face held the thing she had been watching appear and disappear for 4 days. The unguarded thing, but bigger now, and complicated by something that looked, in this moment, on this beach, with the sun full on his face, uncomfortably close to remorse. "Wubit," he said. "Your Grace," she said back, and her voice was entirely level, which surprised her because there was a storm moving through her chest that she would have expected to show. He closed his eyes briefly, opened them. "Let me explain." "You don't have to," she said. "I've been explaining it to myself for days. It wasn't difficult." She shifted Leah against her chest. The baby stirred and settled. "You are someone important enough to have a ship of your own that sent 4 men in a livery boat to find you. You told me you were nobody." "I told you my name was Fazl," he said. "That was true. It was the only true thing you offered." "Yes." He said it without flinching, and that the absence of deflection, the plain, direct acknowledgement, was both the right response and the one that made it harder to stay angry. She was very aware of the 4 liverymen standing at a respectful distance with their eyes carefully forward, aware that this was the kind of scene that would be reported and remembered and possibly embellished. And she was doing it on a beach with salt in her hair and a 4-day-old infant in her arms, and she was still, somehow, the one who felt in command of it. That surprised her. Not long ago, not 4 days ago, not even on the morning she had boarded the ship, she would have made herself small in this moment. She would have found a way to disappear into the edges of it, to let the significance of a man like this fill the space and take up all the air while she stood quietly to the side. She had been good at making herself small. Her husband had never asked her to do it. She had simply learned, over years, that it was easier than the alternative. She was done with easier. She looked at Fasil, at this man who was a duke, or a lord, or whatever English title sat behind your Grace, whose name she had known, and whose everything else she had been given, in pieces and fragments and careful deflections, and she felt her own spine with a clarity that was almost physical. "What is your full name?" she asked. He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "Fazl McConnon Ashford, Duke of Westerfield." He said it the way you say a thing you have been carrying for a long time, not with pride, but with the particular tiredness of someone who cannot put it down. "I was travelling incognito. I do so sometimes, when I need to move when I need to be somewhere, without the weight of it." "Without the weight of it," she repeated. "Of what I am." He looked at her steadily. "Of what people do when they know what I am." She thought about that. She thought about the men on their knees in the sand. She thought about the way he had moved through 4 days of survival with that particular ease, competent and unhurried, and understood now that it had not been detachment. It had been the ease of a man who had, for 4 days, been entirely himself, unnamed and unranked, and simply present, and had found in it a kind of relief he had not expected. She understood that more than she wanted to. "Your Grace," said the nearest liveryman with careful, deferential urgency, "the lady and child. Is there, should we—" "They come with me," Fazl said. "Not a question, not a request." She opened her mouth, and he looked at her, and she saw in his face that he understood her objection before she had voiced it, that he was not claiming her, not making a decision for her. That he was. She read it in the set of his jaw and the careful, almost formal steadiness of his eyes, asking, "You are stranded on an island," he said quietly, "with a child 4 days old, and I know that you are capable of surviving almost anything I have seen it, but I am asking you to let me help. That is all I am doing." The wind moved off the water. Leah made a small sound against her chest, not a cry, just a statement of presence. Temesgen stood to her left with his repaired forehead and his wide eyes moving between the 2 adults, with the expression of someone watching something he knows he will want to remember. Wubit looked at Fasil for a long moment. She thought about the morning she had boarded the ship, the bruise-coloured sea, and the whisper she had ignored. She thought about the storm and the water, and waking on the sand with the smell of salt in her lungs. She thought about the hollow in the rock and the fruit and the fire that had taken longer than it should have. She thought about the stream and Temesgen's fever and the leaves that had drawn the heat from his wound. She thought about Leah being placed on her chest in the dark and the sound of that first cry, and Fazil sitting back from her with his hands on his knees and his face open and entirely undefended. She thought about who she had been when she got on that ship, and who she was standing on this beach now, and measured the distance between them. It was not a short distance. "I have no address," she said. "The letter, the one with my contact in London, was lost in the storm. I don't remember the street clearly." "You're going to London?" he asked. "I was." "Then I will take you to London." He said it simply, the way he said most things. "And we will find your contact." She looked at him. Why? He was quiet for a moment. She watched him consider the real answer and find it and decide to give it. And she appreciated that process, the honesty of it, the refusal to deflect this time. "Because you named your daughter in the dark on an island with nothing," he said, "and you held her like she was the most valuable thing that had ever existed. And I have spent a long time in rooms full of things that are supposed to be valuable, and I have not felt that in a single one of them." The beach was very quiet. Temesgen had pressed his lips together and was looking at the sand with intense concentration. The liverymen were excellent at having no expressions. Wubit looked at Fasil. She looked at him for a long time, long enough that he didn't look away, long enough that the thing between them, whatever it was, unnamed and unresolved and complicated by 4 days of survival, and a secret that had just come into the open, sat visible between them in the morning air. Then she shifted Leah in her arms and said, "My daughter's name is Leah." Something moved across his face. The undefended thing. He let it stay this time. "Leah," he said, and the care he put into the word was so precise and so deliberate that it felt like a decision. She walked toward the longboat. He fell into step beside her, and Temesgen came behind, and the liverymen pushed the boat back into the water without a word, and the island fell away behind them as the oars pulled them toward the ship. She did not look back at it. She had never been good at looking back. But she was aware, sitting in the boat with Leah in her arms and the open water ahead, and Fasil beside her close enough that she could feel the warmth of him, that she was not the woman who had stood at the railing watching Ethiopia disappear. That woman had been running from something and calling it strength. She had been making herself small for so long she had almost forgotten that the smallness was a choice. She was done with that choice. Leah opened her eyes in the light off the water-dark eyes, clear and alert, and already looking at the world with a seriousness that belonged entirely to herself. And Wubit felt the future land in her chest, like something solid, not certain, not safe, but real and hers, and large enough to walk into without shrinking. She looked at Fasil. He was looking ahead at the ship, and his profile against the sky was clean and quiet, and there was something in the set of him that was different from the man who had crouched beside her on the beach on the first morning, something less defended, less contained, as if 4 days without his title had loosened. Something he hadn't known was tight. He would go back to being the Duke of Westerfield. She understood that. He would step onto that ship, and the weight of it would settle back onto his shoulders, and he would carry it the way he had always carried it, with that particular tiredness. But he had given her 4 days of just Fasil, and she had given him 4 days of just herself, and she thought that perhaps the truest thing two people could know about each other was the version that appeared when everything else was stripped away and there was only survival and fire and the sound of a new life insisting on itself. In the dark. She looked back at the island one time, just once. Then she looked ahead at the water, bright and enormous and full of direction, and she held her daughter, and she let herself want what was coming. The ship was called the Meridian Star. She learned its name from Temesgen, who read it off the hull as they pulled alongside it, his voice still carrying that particular wonder of someone who had recently survived something and was finding ordinary details newly remarkable. The ship was large and well kept and crewed by men who moved with the quiet efficiency of people who understood their employer expected things done correctly the first time. They looked at Fazil with the focused attention of people who had been genuinely frightened and were now genuinely relieved. And they looked at Wubit with a careful, respectful blankness that told her they had been well trained in the art of not reacting to things that surprised them. She was helped aboard with a courtesy that was almost ceremonial. She noticed the almost. She noticed the way the first mate's eyes moved from her to Fazil and back, the small calculation happening behind perfectly composed features, the question being filed away for later. She noticed it, and she held Leia closer, and she kept her chin level, and she said nothing, because there was nothing to say that would be more eloquent than simply standing there. Fazil spoke to his crew in low, brisk sentences. Arrangements were made that she was not part of, but that clearly included her, a cabin prepared, water brought, clean cloth that was softer than anything she had touched in 4 days. A woman appeared, one of apparently 2 female staff on board, who introduced herself as Miriam and had the broad, capable hands and the unsentimental warmth of someone who had attended to difficult situations before and found them manageable. Miriam looked at Leah and said, "Oh, she's a good size, and that simple, grounded assessment." The most ordinary thing anyone had said in 4 days made Wubit's eyes fill without warning. She turned away before it showed. She was getting better at that. The cabin was small but warm, and it had a real bed, and when Miriam finally left her alone with Leah and the door was closed, Wubit sat on the edge of the mattress and looked at the 4 walls and the low ceiling and the lamp, swinging gently with the motion of the ship, and she breathed, just breathed. Long and slow and deliberate, the way you breathe when the emergency is over and the body is trying to understand that it is allowed to stop holding itself ready. Leah was asleep across her lap, 4 days old and already sleeping with authority, both fists curled beside her face, entirely committed to it. "We made it," Wubit told her. Her voice came out rougher than she intended. "We made it, and you were there for all of it, and I'm sorry it wasn't warmer." Leah slept on, unconcerned, already herself. There was a knock at the cabin door 2 hours later. She knew it was him before she opened it. She didn't know how she knew some combination of the particular rhythm and the quiet of it, the knock of someone who was not certain they had the right to knock and was doing it anyway. Fazil stood in the passage. He had changed. Of course, he had his own quarters were on this ship, his own clothes, his own world, and the man standing before her now was wearing something clean and dark and well-fitted. And he looked like what he was. She had known what he was for 4 days and had spent most of those days avoiding looking at it directly, and here it was, unavoidable and tailored, and carrying itself with the ease of a man who had been significant his entire life. He looked different. That was the plain truth of it. Not unrecognizable, but different, the way a landscape looks different in full light than it does at dusk, the same shapes, but clarified, and the clarification changed things. "May I come in?" he asked. She stepped back and let him. He looked at the baby first. She watched him do it, that helpless, unguarded look, and then watched him pull it back, and the pulling back was so visible now that it almost made her want to ask him why he bothered. "You should know some things," he said. "Yes," she said. "I should." He sat in the chair beside the small writing desk, and she sat back on the edge of the bed with Leah, and the lamp between them moved gently with the ship's motion and threw warm light across both their faces. He told her about himself with the careful, effortful honesty of someone who was out of practice at it. He was the Duke of Westerfield, which was a title he had inherited at 19 when his father died of a heart that had been failing quietly for years. He was 31 now. He had been born in England to an English duke and an Ethiopian mother, a woman of remarkable education and fiercer will, he said. And the way he said it carried 12 years of missing someone who had died when he was 24. He had her eyes, he said, which was what people always said when they did not know what else to say, about a loss they could see, was still raw. He travelled in disguise sometimes, because the weight of the dukedom had a particular gravity that bent every interaction toward itself, and he had wanted, on this journey, to think clearly. There were decisions to be made about the estate, about the seat in Parliament, about a marriage negotiation that had been progressing with the mechanical inevitability of everything in his life. A negotiation he had not wanted and had not yet found the courage to end, because ending it required a conversation that required certainty he hadn't had. He stopped when he said marriage. He stopped and looked at her, and the lamplight moved across his face. She looked back at him. "Are you asking me something?" she said. "No," he said, "not yet." That not yet sat between them like a living thing. She let it sit. She was not a woman who would be rushed into responding to a not yet, and he seemed to understand that, because he did not press it. "I want to find Aziza," she said. "My mother's friend. She offered me a home. We will find her. If the street name I remember is wrong." Wubit. He said her name the way he had said it on the island, with that same particular care. "There are exactly 2 streets in London I cannot find. I will find her." She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about trust, what it was made of, how much of it you needed before you could act on it, whether 4 days in an impossible situation counted for more or less than years of ordinary knowledge. She thought about her husband, who had known her for 6 years and trusted her for none of them. She thought about Aziza, who had known only her name and her mother's, and had offered a home out of pure, generous faith. Trust, she decided, was not about time. It was about what a person did when they thought you weren't watching. She had watched Faisal for 4 days when he thought she was too exhausted or too focused on surviving to notice. She had seen every unguarded thing, and she had not once seen anything small. London appeared on the horizon on the 7th morning. She was on deck when she first saw it, Leah bound against her chest in a strip of cloth Miriam had shown her how to knot. And the city emerged from the morning haze, like something being slowly decided, first just a smudge of grey and brown, then shapes, then the unmistakable press of a place that had been accumulating itself for centuries and had no intention of stopping. The Thames was the colour of pewter. The air was cold in a way that was entirely different from the cold of the island. This was a city cold, layered and textured and carrying the smell of coal, smoke and bread and the particular damp of a river that had seen everything. She stood at the railing and looked at it and felt, for the first time, the full strangeness of where she was. She had left Ethiopia carrying a child and a plan and an address. She had lost the plan and the address on the same night. She was arriving at this enormous, grey, certain city with nothing but the child and herself, and the child was real and the self was altered, and the city did not care about either. Faisal came to stand beside her. He did not speak for a moment. They looked at London together, which felt oddly intimate, the way standing beside someone in silence always carries more weight than standing beside them with words. "It frightens most people the first time," he said. "I'm not frightened," she said, and then considered it honestly. "I'm something. I'm not sure it's fright." "What is it?" She thought about it. Leah shifted against her chest, making a small sound of general commentary. "It's the feeling of understanding that the story is not done," she said. "That you have survived the part that was supposed to be impossible, and now you are standing at the beginning of something else, and you do not know its shape yet." Faisal was quiet for a long moment. "Yes," he said, "that is exactly what it is." She looked at him. He was looking at the city, and his face was the open one, the one from the island. And she understood that being here beside her in this moment was costing him something, in the same way the not yet had cost him something, that he was standing at a beginning too, and its shape was unclear to him as well. And this man, who always seemed to know the ground beneath his feet, was standing on something unsteady and choosing to stand on it anyway. She found Aziza on the 3rd day. The street name, she remembered, had been almost right, one word transposed, one detail wrong, but Faisal had brought her through it. with the patience of someone who had decided to see a thing done properly. And when the door of the narrow house on the correct street opened, and a small, round woman with white at her temples, and eyes that were immediately bright with something between joy and grief, stood looking at her, Wubit felt her chest fill with a warmth so sudden it was almost painful. "You look like your mother," Aziza said, which was not quite hello, and then she looked at the baby, and her hand came to her mouth, and she stepped aside and said, "Come in, come in. Both of you, come in." Fazil had waited at the carriage. She had not asked him to. He had simply done it, had understood without being told that this was a reunion that did not belong to him, that this was a door she needed to walk through herself. And the understanding of it had made her pause at the carriage step and look back at him and say his name quietly, which was all she had, and somehow all that was needed. He had nodded once and looked at his hands. She had gone inside. Aziza's house was warm. It smelled of spice and beeswax, and the particular sweetness of rooms that have been kept by someone who believes a home should be felt as well as seen. There was a chair by the fire that looked like it had been sat in 10,000 times, and a table with more food on it than two people could eat, because Aziza was clearly a woman who met every situation with provisions. Wubit sat in the chair by the fire, with Leah in her arms, and told Aziza most of the truth, the storm, the island. Temesgen, who had been delivered safely to the port authority that morning, and who had shaken her hand with two of his and called her ma'am with a sincerity that had threatened to undo her entirely. She told Aziza about surviving. She said Fasil's name without his title, and Aziza looked at her with the particular, quiet attention of a woman who has been alive long enough to hear what is not being said. "Is he a good man?" Aziza asked. Wubit looked at the fire. She thought about a man crouching in the sand, in ruined clothes, striking sparks in the dark. She thought about fruit carried in the fold of a coat. She thought about a voice saying breathe, and meaning it as something more than instruction. "I think so," she said. "I think he is learning to be." Aziza nodded slowly. "Those are the best kind," she said, "the ones who are still working at it." The invitation came on the 6th day in London. It was formal, delivered by a man in the dark blue livery she now recognized, and it was addressed to her full name, written in a hand she had not yet learned but already knew, and it asked if she would take tea at Westerfield House at her convenience. At her convenience. She had read that twice. As if her convenience was a real thing. As if she was the kind of woman whose schedule was consulted. She held the letter for a long time. Aziza was across the table watching her with that same quiet attention, and Leah was in the small wooden cradle Aziza had produced from somewhere upstairs, with the matter-of-fact competence of a woman who had been waiting for exactly this to be needed. And the fire crackled, and the city moved outside the window, and everything was still. She thought about the woman who had boarded a ship in a bruise-coloured dawn. She thought about this woman, sitting in a warm chair, in a warm house, in a city she did not know, with a daughter 6 days old, and an uncertain future, and an invitation written in a careful hand. She thought about the distance between those two women, and felt it not as loss, but as proof. Proof that the ground beneath her had always been more solid than she was told. Proof that she had always been capable of exactly this, not of surviving, she had never doubted that, but of arriving. Of showing up at the door of the next thing, without shrinking and walking through it standing up. She set the letter on the table. "Well," Aziza said. "I'm going to take tea," Wubit said, "at my convenience." Aziza smiled into her cup. "Good girl," she said. Outside, London continued its enormous, indifferent life. The Thames ran grey and silver toward the sea. Leah slept in her cradle with her fists curled and her face serious, and her whole small future entirely ahead of her, enormous and unwritten. Wubit looked at her daughter for a long time. There was a man in a house on the other side of this city who had held himself apart from the world for so long that when the world arrived on his beach, in the shape of a stranded woman with salt in her hair and a life in her belly, He had not known what to do with the fact that it moved him. She did not know what he would do with that feeling, now that they were both back inside their lives and the island was gone, and the weight of who he was had settled back over him. She did not know whether he would let it matter or find a way to return it to its distance. She did not know, and the not knowing was real, and she was going to sit with it and let it be real. But she was going to take the tea. She was going to walk into Westerfield House with her daughter and her spine and every piece of herself she had nearly let be reduced. And she was going to sit across from a duke who had once shared a fire with her on an island they couldn't name. And she was going to look at him with clear eyes. And she was going to let whatever was true between them be true. She was done with smaller versions of herself. The island had burned them away. Leah had replaced them with something that did not fit in small spaces. She would not be shrinking back. Can I ask you something before you go? If you had been Wubit, standing at that door with your daughter in your arms and everything uncertain, would you have walked in? Because I think the hardest thing in the world is not surviving the storm. It is deciding, after the storm, that you are still worth the room you take up. If this story moved you, if Wubit and Leah and the man who claimed to be nobody found a piece of something real in you, please subscribe to this channel and ring that notification bell. This journey is only just beginning, and I promise you, what comes next inside those walls of Westerfield House will reach places this island only touched. Come back for it. Bring someone who needs it. And thank you, from the bottom of my heart, for being here.